So Trump blinked first, but Canada's European defense deal had been signed 5 months before the threat. According to the White House, a 50% tariff was announced on roughly $20 billion in Canadian goods. It gave the measure a 30-day runway before collection began. 48 hours later, the United States Trade Representative was telling senators that Washington wanted an interim arrangement with Canada. But Ottawa was no longer standing where Washington thought it was standing. According to the Council of the European Union, Canada had already become the first non-European country admitted into a €150 billion defense procurement instrument. The signature was not waiting in a draft folder. It was dated February 14. That is the detail that changes the story. Warren Buffett's economic logic, applied to this confrontation, reduces the entire spectacle to one sentence. A threat is only leverage, while the other side still needs your permission. In Buffett terms, Canada did not answer a tariff with a speech. It answered by changing the set of doors available to Canadian companies, Canadian workers, Canadian pension funds, and Canadian defense manufacturers. And here is the part Washington did not appear prepared to confront. The 50% tariff targeted roughly $20 billion in trade, but the European channel Canada had already secured was attached to a €150 billion pool of long-term defense financing. One number was designed to frighten, the other had already been written into law, procurement rules, industrial planning, and security cooperation. When you hear how the timeline was presented inside Washington, why the February 14 signature landed like a physical object on the table, and why the 30-day window suddenly began to look less like dominance and more like an invitation to negotiate, you will understand why trade officials on both sides are treating this as a structural turning point. Hit subscribe because the public argument is about tariffs, while the real contest is over who controls the next generation of contracts. One point of precision before going further. The official dates and trade actions in this account are documented. The private room exchanges are a reconstruction from those public positions, and the Buffett lines are analytical paraphrases, not authenticated remarks. And what happened next makes the reversal even more consequential. Let me give you the full context because this did not happen in a vacuum. For more than 3 decades, the North American economy was built around one assumption: political arguments could become loud. Elections could change priorities. Tariffs could appear at the margins. But the integrated production system connecting Canada, the United States, and Mexico would remain the central fact. Auto parts crossed the border repeatedly before a finished vehicle reached a dealership. Canadian aluminum moved into American factories. American machinery moved into Canadian plants. Energy, food, rail, banking, aerospace, and defense supply chains were planned around continuity. That assumption began to weaken under repeated tariff threats, sectoral duties, and the decision to push the USMCA into annual reviews rather than grant it a clean renewal. It does not immediately shut the border. It does something quieter. It makes every 5-year investment model carry a political risk discount. A plant expansion is delayed. A supplier contract is shortened. A retirement fund demands a higher return before committing capital. Canada's response was not improvised in July. It had been building in layers. According to Canadian and European government records, the commercial foundation already existed through the Canada-European Union Trade Agreement, provisionally applied since 2017. Then, in June 2025, Canada and the European Union signed a broader security and defense partnership. In September, European governments authorized negotiations for Canadian participation in the Security Action for Europe instrument, known as SAFE. In December, member state representatives endorsed the terms. On February 14, 2026, the agreement was signed. On June 15, it was formally concluded. February 14. That date matters because it came months before the latest 50% tariff threat. The €150 billion instrument was not assembled as a weekend retaliation. It was the product of legal drafting, procurement rules, security reviews, industrial eligibility standards, and political approval across European capitals. Canada then kept building around it. In June, Ottawa and Paris signed a Security of Information Agreement designed to allow classified cooperation in defense, space, cyber, advanced communications, maritime systems, and dual-use technology. In early July, Canada advanced a major submarine procurement with a European supplier and tied the project to technology transfer and Canadian participation in global supply chains. These were operating mechanisms. Then came July 20. The White House announced 50% tariffs on selected Canadian imports, under a rarely used section of a 1930 trade law. The measures covered roughly $20 billion in goods and were designed to apply even to covered products qualifying under the North American Agreement. The administration exempted energy, potash, critical minerals, fish, and products already captured by other national security tariffs, revealing an important contradiction. Washington wanted maximum pressure without disrupting the inputs American industry could not easily replace. Public statements from officials on both sides framed the dispute differently. Washington said Canada discriminated against U.S. vehicles, alcohol, and dairy, while giving European products preferential access. Ottawa's position was that it was defending Canadian workers and responding to earlier American tariffs. Both sides said they were protecting fairness, but only one side had already signed an alternative industrial pathway into a €150 billion market. The Canadian preparation was methodical. Trade officials briefed provinces, manufacturers, labor groups, agricultural associations, defense contractors, banks, and institutional investors. Scenario papers were updated around the same three numbers: 50%, $20 billion, and 30 days. Which shipments could be accelerated? Which contracts could be rerouted? Which companies required liquidity? Which American customers would absorb part of the cost? Which European tenders could Canadian firms now pursue? The American preparation focused on coercive effect. The tariff was expected to force Ottawa back to the table before the 30-day clock expired. The theory assumed Canada still believed the United States was its only serious economic and security platform. For the Canadian government, that assumption was the line in the sand. The country could negotiate with Washington. It could not build its future around Washington's predictability. And then, inside a quiet Washington briefing room, the February 14 signature was placed beside the 30-day tariff order. That was the moment the theory of leverage met the physical evidence that Canada had already moved. The reconstruction begins shortly after 8 in the morning in the Roosevelt room, the long rectangular space beside the Oval Office where polished wood, presidential portraits, and paired national flags are meant to impose order on difficult conversations. Soft yellow light reflects off the mahogany table. Water glasses sit at every place. A silver coffee service waits beneath a Roosevelt portrait. On the American side, tariff proclamations rest in white folders bearing the presidential seal. On the Canadian side sit a black binder, a laptop, and a thin blue folder containing the EU Council decision. That thin blue folder is the most important object in the room. The 50% tariff has been announced. Roughly $20 billion in goods are exposed. The 30-day clock is running. The Canadian officials do not begin with an appeal. They begin with a timeline. The senior Canadian representative opens the black binder and walks through the legal sequence in a voice that is controlled, almost administrative. The Canada-EU Security and Defense Partnership, June 2025. Authorization to negotiate safe participation, September. Member state endorsement, December. Signature, February 14th. Formal conclusion, June 15th. Canadian eligibility to compete within a €150 billion European defense financing framework. No accusation, just dates. An American trade aide interrupts. The U.S. position, he says, is that Canada has discriminated against American products. The 50% rate will remain unless Ottawa addresses autos, alcohol, and dairy. He taps the tariff folder twice. The document is supposed to be the source of gravity in the room. The Canadian representative looks at the folder, then back at the aide. We are prepared to discuss irritants, the reconstructed reply goes, reflecting Ottawa's public position. We are not prepared to treat Canadian diversification as an offense requiring American permission. The first shift is visible. An American advisor folds his arms. Another turns a page without reading it. A communications official writes on a yellow pad, then covers the note with her hand. The U.S. team returns to the 30-day window. There is time, they argue, to avoid implementation. There is time for Canada to demonstrate flexibility. There is time to change course. The Canadian side asks a direct question. Change course from what? Liquor restrictions, vehicle rules, European dairy access, or participation in Europe's defense industrial system. The room becomes quieter. According to the official American statement, the tariffs were intended to punish Canada for giving European dairy products better access and for retaliating against earlier U.S. measures. That language matters because it placed Europe inside the dispute. Washington was no longer merely contesting a tariff line. It was objecting to the architecture of Canada's alternative partnerships. The senior American official then makes the request that brings the entire meeting to its turning point. The reconstructed substance is this: if Canada wants relief from the 50% tariff on roughly $20 billion in goods, Ottawa should pause measures favoring European suppliers and delay defense procurement preferences until a North American arrangement is reached. The Canadian official does not answer immediately. He opens the thin blue folder. Paper slides against cardboard. A metal clip releases. He places the EU Council decision in the middle of the table where everyone can read it. Canadian participation in SAFE, the €150 billion instrument, signed February 14, 2026. Then he places a second page beside it. Formal conclusion, June 15th. The tariff folder remains on the American side. The signed agreement sits between the delegations. The Canadian official speaks slowly. There is nothing to delay. It was signed on February 14th. Silence. 5 seconds, then 10. An American advisor looks toward the head of the table. The communications official stops writing. One of the water glasses has a line of condensation running down its side, collecting in a dark circle on the polished wood. Nobody reaches for it. The Canadian official continues. You are asking Canada to suspend a completed agreement because of a tariff announced 5 months later. Another pause. This is not a negotiating demand. It is a request to reverse time. That is the devastating irony at the center of the entire episode. The 50% tariff was designed to force Canada to abandon the very diversification that repeated American tariff threats had accelerated. The policy intended to prove that Canada had no alternatives arrived after Canada had signed one. The American side shifts to scale. The €150 billion figure, they argue, is a European financing ceiling, not guaranteed Canadian revenue. That is correct. Canadian companies will not receive €150 billion. They must compete. Contracts will be distributed over years. Eligibility is not the same as an award. The Canadian response is precise. Europe does not need to replace every American dollar tomorrow to change Washington's leverage today. It only needs to create credible options: an aerospace contract, a cyber consortium, a munitions line, a submarine supply agreement. Each contract placed elsewhere reduces the cost of saying no next time. The senior Canadian official turns to the $20 billion figure. The immediate tariff exposure is real, he says. Workers can be hurt. Producers of cement, dairy products, beverages, sporting goods, and manufactured inputs cannot simply pivot overnight. Ottawa is not pretending otherwise. But a 30-day threat cannot be allowed to dictate a 30-year industrial strategy. A 30-day threat cannot dictate a 30-year strategy. One American official closes the tariff briefing book, quietly. The conversation is no longer about whether Canada will capitulate. It is about what Washington can offer to prevent more investment, procurement, and trust from moving across the Atlantic. The American side asks whether Ottawa is still open to an interim arrangement. The Canadian answer is yes, but the conditions have changed. Relief from the 50% tariff must be discussed as relief from an American-imposed cost, not as payment for Canadian obedience. The roughly $20 billion in affected trade must be stabilized. The 30-day window must be used for serious work, not public humiliation. USMCA rules must be treated as rules, not optional courtesies. And Canada's European agreements are not bargaining chips because they are already sovereign commitments. No one walks out, no voice rises. The restraint makes the moment more serious. The meeting ends with the blue folder still open to February 14 and the white tariff folder closed. The coffee on the sideboard has gone untouched. The water glass has left a ring on the table. The American delegation entered believing the 50% number would dominate the room. It left understanding that the €150 billion number had been there first. And within hours, the public language began to change. The aftermath moved quickly because markets do not wait for diplomats to recover their composure. The White House publicly described the 50% tariffs as decisive action to defend American workers. Canadian officials convened their advisory committee and repeated that Ottawa would defend Canadian workers, farmers, businesses, and families. The language sounded familiar. The sequence did not. Reuters reported that on July 22nd, the U.S. Trade Representative told the Senate Finance Committee that Washington wanted interim arrangements with Canada and Mexico by the end of the year. The hardest USMCA issues, including auto rules, labor provisions, and environmental standards, could spill into 2027. That was the public confirmation of the shift. 48 hours after threatening roughly $20 billion in Canadian goods with a 50% tariff, the administration was explaining how badly it wanted a framework to keep negotiations alive. Diplomats do not seek an interim arrangement when leverage has produced surrender. They seek one when the threatened outcome carries costs for both sides. The market reaction was not a panic. It was more revealing than panic. According to Reuters market reporting, the Canadian dollar fell to a one-week low, trading near 1.4104 to the US dollar, or about 70.9 American cents. Investors reduced expectations for Bank of Canada rate increases. The Canadian two-year yield moved lower, and the yield gap with comparable U.S. debt widened to levels not seen since the previous year. That is how markets translate political uncertainty. A weaker currency, altered rate expectations, postponed investment, and a higher risk premium embedded quietly inside every financing decision. For older households, this is not abstract. A weaker Canadian dollar can raise the cost of imported goods and winter travel. Trade uncertainty can weaken industrial earnings held inside retirement funds. American households can face higher prices when importers pass through a 50% duty. Workers in Michigan, Ohio, Pennsylvania, Ontario, Quebec, and Alberta can lose hours long before a chief executive announces a permanent closure. Before I continue, let me ask you something important. Have you ever made a major decision while feeling worried, rushed, or unsure which information you could trust? That is how costly mistakes often begin. A frightening headline can influence your investments. Conflicting health advice can leave you confused. A convincing salesperson, online scam, or emotional family situation can pressure you into acting before you have checked the facts. And after 50, the consequences can be much greater. One poor decision may affect your retirement savings, your health, your independence, or your peace of mind for years. That is why I want you to take a look at the decision trap. It is a practical guide designed to help adults over 50 recognize fear, manipulation, hidden bias, misleading information, and high-pressure tactics before making an important decision. Inside, you will find a simple step-by-step system for slowing the situation down, checking the evidence, asking the right questions, comparing your options, and protecting yourself from mistakes that could become expensive. Do not wait until a bad decision teaches you the lesson the hard way. Click the link in the description and get your copy of The Decision Trap. Now, with that important warning in mind, let's get back to our main topic. Then came the institutional damage. The USMCA and its predecessor had underpinned roughly $1.6 trillion in annual regional trade. Yet Canada was excluded from the active U.S.-Mexico track while Washington threatened a separate 50% penalty on approximately $20 billion in Canadian goods. The North American framework was being treated not as a rules-based system, but as a sequence of bilateral pressure campaigns. Each exception weakened the norm that agreements bind all parties. Each threat taught companies to plan around the agreement rather than rely on it. And there was one image that captured the entire deterioration. Canada canceled the joint celebration for the opening of the Gordie Howe International Bridge after the tariff announcement. The bridge itself would still carry trucks between Windsor and Detroit. Steel, concrete, customs technology, and years of planning would continue serving the integrated economy. But the two governments could no longer stand together comfortably to open it. Think about that for a moment. A bridge built to make trade more reliable opened under a dispute making trade less reliable. Inside corporate offices, contingency work accelerated. Importers reviewed inventories before the 30-day deadline. Canadian exporters examined whether shipments could be redirected. Banks ran stress tests on clients exposed to the $20 billion category. Defense companies studied the €150 billion European procurement pipeline with renewed urgency. Every firm understood the same thing. Political language can reverse overnight, but contracts, factories, and certification processes require years. That is where Warren Buffett's economic translation becomes unavoidable, because the headline was 50%, but the real cost was uncertainty compounding across a $1.6 trillion system. Buffett's framework starts with a distinction politicians often blur. Price is not value, and pressure is not power. The 50% tariff is a price imposed at the border. It can change invoices immediately. It can disrupt roughly $20 billion in trade. It can force a producer to decide whether to absorb the cost, raise the customer's price, cancel the shipment, or search for another buyer. That is real leverage in the short term. But power is different. Power is the ability to influence the other side's long-term choices without imposing an unacceptable cost on yourself. Bank of Canada projections confirm that U.S. trade policy still carries enormous power. Canada sends most of its merchandise exports south. American consumers, ports, railways, factories, and capital markets remain central to Canada. Any claim that Europe can replace the United States overnight is unserious. But that is not what Canada needs Europe to do. Canada only needs the €150 billion safe channel, the existing European trade agreement, the French security arrangement, and European defense partnerships to reduce dependence at the margin. 10% of future procurement moved elsewhere can alter negotiating behavior. A single major submarine program can create decades of supplier relationships. A secure communications contract can produce certification, intellectual property, and workforce skills that make the next contract easier. Diversification compounds. That is the Buffett translation. A business does not eliminate its largest customer before it develops alternatives. It develops alternatives so the largest customer can no longer dictate every term. In more than 60 years of allocating capital, buying companies, evaluating managers, and watching governments interfere with markets, Warren Buffett has returned repeatedly to a basic truth. Durable advantage comes from optionality, reputation, and patience. A company with one buyer is not fully independent. A country with one dominant export route is not fully protected. And a negotiator who mistakes the other side's dependence for permanent obedience eventually overplays the position. Applied here, the analytical paraphrase is devastating. Canada did not have to win the trade war. It only had to make American pressure less decisive. Pause on that. The White House threatened 50% on roughly $20 billion and gave itself 30 days to extract movement. Canada's most important alternative arrangement had been signed on February 14th and formally completed before the tariff order existed. The €150 billion platform was already open. European procurement rules were already being implemented. Industrial relationships were already forming. This is where the devastating irony becomes mathematical. The tariff was meant to punish Canada for diversifying, but the tariff increased the value of diversification. Every chief executive who had questioned the cost of qualifying for European tenders now had a new reason to proceed. Every provincial government debating support for export infrastructure now had a new argument. Every pension manager calculating political risk now had another data point. The policy designed to pull Canada back toward the United States strengthened the business case for moving incrementally away. Buffett's philosophy also explains why the 30-day window matters. A deadline can concentrate attention, but it can also expose the person who set it. If the deadline passes and the tariff damages American importers, builders, retailers, and consumers, Washington must decide whether to absorb the pain, broaden exemptions, or negotiate. If it retreats, the threat loses credibility. If it proceeds, diversification accelerates. That is not a position of clean dominance. It is a narrowing corridor. A Buffett-style verdict would be simple. The most expensive mistake in business is using short-term pressure to teach your best customer how to live without you. That line reaches beyond Donald Trump and Mark Carney. It applies to every boardroom, every alliance, and every institution built on trust. Agreements survive disagreement when the rules remain credible. Markets survive volatility when participants believe tomorrow's framework will still exist. Retirement systems survive shocks when capital can plan beyond the next election. The 50% tariff put roughly $20 billion at risk. But the deeper asset being repriced was confidence across a $1.6 trillion North American trading system. And once confidence is repriced, the consequences do not remain inside trade ministries. They move into factories, defense commands, election maps, and alliance rooms around the world. The consequences begin with economics and do not end there. First, supply chains begin to redirect at the edges. A Canadian defense manufacturer that wins a European contract hires engineers, certifies components, and signs subcontracts that may last 15 or 20 years. A port expansion on the Atlantic coast does not disappear when a tariff is withdrawn. A rail connection built to move goods east does not unbuild itself because Washington changes tone. The €150 billion safe framework matters not because Canada will capture all of it, but because each successful Canadian bid creates infrastructure and relationships that become harder to reverse. The same is true on the American side. A 50% tariff on roughly $20 billion in Canadian goods can protect one producer while raising costs for another. Cement matters to construction. Specialty inputs matter to manufacturing. Food and beverages matter to retailers. Sporting goods matter to distributors. Tariff policy does not stop at the border. It travels through balance sheets until somebody pays. The cost is divided among producers, importers, and consumers, often invisibly. Second, the political consequences spread across regions that do not vote as a single bloc. Michigan wants predictable auto supply chains. Ohio and Pennsylvania want competitive industrial inputs. Border states want truck traffic and tourism. Canadian provinces want market access but also political dignity. A policy designed to demonstrate strength can create a coalition of mayors, governors, premiers, unions, manufacturers, farmers, and retirees demanding exceptions. The more exceptions Washington grants, the weaker the 50% headline becomes. The fewer it grants, the more economic pain accumulates inside the United States. Third, the defense consequences are more delicate than either government wants to say publicly. NORAD depends on daily operational trust between American and Canadian officers. Five Eyes intelligence sharing depends on confidence that sensitive information will be protected and political commitments will be honored. Arctic security depends on airfields, radar, satellites, ports, ice-capable vessels, undersea awareness, and supply chains that cannot be improvised after a crisis begins. Trade disputes do not end military cooperation, but repeated economic coercion changes its atmosphere. When Canada signs secure information agreements with France, joins a 150 billion European defense mechanism, and links submarine procurement to European industrial supply chains, it is not leaving NORAD or Five Eyes. It is building additional pillars. A close ally with more options may be resilient. An ally seeking options because it doubts American reliability is also a warning. Fourth, the international signal is clear. Germany watches. France watches. The United Kingdom, Japan, Australia, South Korea, Poland, and the Philippines watch. Their question is not whether Canada can replace the United States. Their question is whether any signed agreement with Washington can be treated as durable when a 50% tariff can be imposed on roughly $20 billion in allied trade under a statute from 1930. If that is how America treats the country with which it shares the world's longest peaceful border, what protection does a less integrated ally possess? Adversaries gain without paying for the advantage. China can present itself as an alternative buyer. Russia can point to tension inside the Western alliance. Neither Beijing nor Moscow has to persuade Canada to abandon the United States. They only need Washington to make allied diversification appear prudent. That is the ultimate irony. A policy designed to project American strength gives strategic competitors evidence that American commitments can be conditional, personal, and temporary. This is how structural failure develops. Stress from one direction can be absorbed. Tariffs alone can be negotiated. Political insults alone can be survived. Procurement changes alone can be managed. But apply stress simultaneously to trade, currency, investment, defense, institutional rules, and public trust. And each problem removes options for solving the others. The $20 billion exposure is immediate. The 30-day clock is visible. The 50% rate is dramatic, but the 150 billion euro European channel is patient. It operates through tenders, certifications, financing, and contracts. It compounds quietly. And quiet changes are often the ones governments notice last. The final question is no longer whether Trump can make Canada feel pressure. He can. The question is whether that pressure now produces concessions or produces a more independent Canada faster. So the central fact is not that Canada escaped American pressure. It did not. A 50% tariff on roughly $20 billion in goods can damage real companies and real families. The 30-day window can force painful decisions. The United States remains Canada's largest market, its most integrated industrial partner, and its indispensable defense ally. But the old assumption has broken. Washington acted as though pressure would force Canada to wait. Canada had already signed. February 14 was on the document. The 150 billion euro European channel was legally open before the latest threat was announced. The White House could still impose a cost. It could no longer assume that cost would produce the same obedience. That is the difference between influence and control. The philosophical verdict is not partisan. Governments change. Leaders change. Tariff rates change. The underlying principle does not. Trust is a productive asset. Predictability is economic infrastructure. Institutions matter because they allow people who disagree to plan together anyway. Once those assets are treated as disposable, capital does what frightened capital has always done. It diversifies. It shortens commitments. It demands insurance. It builds another route. Warren Buffett's devastating verdict, expressed as an analytical paraphrase, is this: the United States may win the right to collect the tariff and still lose the business decision that mattered. That is what should concern Americans and Canadians approaching retirement, workers dependent on industrial supply chains, military families who understand the importance of NORAD and Five Eyes, and anyone who remembers when an agreement between allied governments was expected to survive a change in political mood. The 50% rate is loud. The $20 billion exposure is immediate. The 30-day deadline is visible. The 150 billion euro system is quiet. Contracts will be evaluated. Suppliers will be certified. Submarine, aerospace, cyber, munitions, and secure communications partnerships will mature. Atlantic infrastructure will be funded. European relationships will deepen. Each milestone will make the next Canadian refusal less costly and the next American threat less decisive. Trump blinked first, not because the tariff disappeared, but because Washington moved from punishment to seeking an interim arrangement, while Canada's alternative was already signed. Keep an eye on the 30-day clock. The negotiation is only beginning, but the diversification is already in motion. Before you leave, think about what one bad decision could cost you. A rushed investment, a misleading health claim, a convincing scam, or one decision made under fear could cost far more than $59. The decision trap gives you a practical system to slow down, verify the facts, recognize pressure, and protect your money, health, independence, and peace of mind. You may hesitate over the price today, but the real question is this: what could it cost you to face your next major decision without a clear system? Click the link in the description and get the decision trap for $59. Because avoiding one preventable mistake could make this guide worth many times its price.
Paspin ka panashi zama put paspin ka panashi sabar ba mizrasta da didanshi sabar ba mizrasta da didanshi zama put paspin ka panashi zama put paspin ka panashi sabar ba mizrasta da didanshi sabar ba mizrasta da didanshi badanshi sabar ba mizrasta da didanshi zama put paspin ka panashi zama put paspin ka panashi sabar ba mizrasta da didanshi sabar ba mizrasta da didanshi خمارو د رنزور کاړیا شي مخ چې زما پټ پسپین کپن شي صبر با مې زړه ستا د دیدن شي صبر با مې زړه ستا د دیدن شي پختنا ولې ناراضي اوس مې په پختنا ولې ناراضي اوس مې په پختنا ولې ناراضي اسه به خراب د مینې خوان شي صبر به مې زړه ستا د دیدن شي مخ چې زما پټ پسپین کپن شي مخ چې زما پټ پسپین کپن شي صبر به مې زړه ستا د دیدن شي صبر به مې زړه ستا د دیدن شي د برباد عبدل زرین کړما اسه د برباد عبدل زرین کړما اسه د برباد عبدل زرین کړما په आवाज د خالد شاه مې زړه پیوان شي صبر به مې زړه ستا د دیدن شي مخ چې زما پټ پسپین کپن شي مخ چې زما پټ پسپین کپن شي صبر به مې زړه ستا د دیدن شي صبر به مې زړه ستا د دیدن شي